The plains of South Texas hold an American empire so enormous that its name became synonymous with the Texas frontier, the legendary King Ranch. But its story did not begin with a wealthy dynasty or an established cattle empire. It began in the 1850s with Richard King, an Irish-born immigrant who rose from humble beginnings to become a steamboat captain on the Rio Grande. While traveling through South Texas region, King saw something others overlooked, a landscape that could become the foundation of a cattle operation. In 1853, he began acquiring land near Santa Gertrudis Creek, laying the foundation for what would become one of the most famous and influential ranches in American history. But owning land was only the beginning. South Texas was harsh and unpredictable with extreme heat, scarce water, wild cattle, and enormous distances separating settlements and markets. Every expansion carried risks, and turning frontier land into a profitable enterprise required money, organization, and determination. Richard King began building a system around cattle, land, transportation, and trade, transforming his holdings into a growing business. Yet King would not build this empire alone. Henrietta King, who would become his wife, would eventually play an important role in the ranch's future and legacy. What began as one man's gamble on the Texas frontier was about to become something greater, a sprawling empire that would shape cattle ranching and Texas history. But how did a steamboat captain build an empire on this scale? Richard King's first years in South Texas were anything but easy. The land he had acquired was vast, but turning open frontier into a working ranch required far more than money. Cattle had to be gathered, water sources identified, trails established, and workers organized across distances that could stretch for miles. King understood that the future of his ranch depended on creating a system capable of operating in a landscape where nature itself could become an obstacle. His experience on the Rio Grande had already taught him how important transportation and trade were, and he began applying that knowledge to his growing cattle operation. During this period, another important chapter of his life was beginning. King met Henrietta Chamberlain, a young woman who would become his wife and eventually one of the most important figures in the ranch's history. Their marriage connected the personal story of the King family with the rapidly expanding ranch enterprise. As cattle numbers increased, King continued acquiring additional land and developing the ranch around livestock production. He also relied on trusted associates and experienced frontier workers who understood the demands of South Texas. Among those associates was Mifflin Kennedy, a businessman with whom King had previously worked on the Rio Grande. Their partnership would become especially important as the ranch expanded. What started as scattered parcels of difficult frontier land was slowly becoming an organized operation. Yet the biggest challenges were still ahead. Political conflict, war, economic uncertainty, and the dangerous cattle trade would soon test whether Richard King's growing ranch could survive, and whether his vision could become a permanent Texas institution. Then came the conflict that threatened to tear the United States apart. When the Civil War began in 1861, South Texas was pulled into a dangerous period of political uncertainty, military disruption, and economic instability. For Richard King, the war was not simply a distant national struggle. It directly affected the ranch, its cattle, transportation routes, and access to markets. The region's position near the Mexican border suddenly became more important than ever. With normal trade disrupted, cattle could no longer move through the same channels as before, forcing ranchers to adapt quickly. King and his associates understood that the border could provide an alternative route for moving livestock and supplies. The Rio Grande became a critical link between South Texas and markets across the border. But operating a ranch during wartime carried serious risks. Livestock could be stolen, transportation could become dangerous, and political loyalties could divide communities. King had to protect the ranch while keeping his business alive in an increasingly uncertain environment. His partnership with Mifflin Kennedy became especially valuable during these difficult years, as both men understood transportation, trade, and the commercial potential of the border region. Meanwhile, the ranch continued to accumulate cattle, creating an asset that could become even more valuable once the war ended. The conflict changed Texas, but it also revealed something important about King's strategy. He was not simply building a ranch for the present. He was creating a business capable of surviving disruption. When the war finally came to an end, South Texas would face a new economic reality, and King Ranch would be positioned to take advantage of it. When the Civil War ended, Texas entered a completely different economic era. Across the South, cattle that had once been difficult to sell suddenly became a valuable opportunity, and South Texas was positioned to supply the growing demand. Richard King understood what was happening. His ranch already held large herds and enormous stretches of land, but the real challenge was getting cattle to profitable markets. In the years that followed, cattle drives became a defining part of the Texas frontier. Herds could be moved north toward emerging railroad connections and distant markets, turning thousands of cattle into a source of enormous potential wealth. King began expanding his operations and improving the organization of the ranch, while experienced ranch hands managed increasingly large herds across the South Texas plains. The ranch was no longer simply a collection of frontier properties. It was becoming a carefully organized business. Richard King also understood that land itself was power. He continued acquiring and consolidating property, creating a ranch whose scale was becoming extraordinary even by Texas standards. But expansion brought new challenges. The larger the ranch became, the more difficult it was to manage livestock, workers, water, transportation, and security across such a vast territory. King needed people he could trust and systems that could survive beyond his own involvement. Meanwhile, Henrietta King remained closely connected to the family and the growing enterprise, becoming increasingly important to the ranch's future. By the late 1870s, King Ranch was emerging as a major force in South Texas. Yet the man who had started it would not live forever. Richard King's health was beginning to decline, and the question of who would carry his enormous legacy into the future was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard King's story was approaching its final chapter, but the ranch he had built was only beginning its greatest transformation. In 1885, after years of expanding the operation across South Texas, Richard King died, leaving behind an enormous ranching enterprise and a family whose future was now tied to the land. The responsibility of protecting that legacy fell heavily on Henrietta King. Rather than allowing the ranch to decline, she worked to preserve the property and maintain the business that she and Richard had built together. Henrietta relied on trusted managers and experienced ranchers to keep the vast operation running, while the King family continued to strengthen its position in South Texas. Over the following decades, King Ranch evolved beyond the frontier cattle operation Richard had first imagined. New ranching methods, improved livestock management, transportation, and eventually innovative breeding programs helped transform the property into one of the most influential ranching enterprises in American history. Its story also became part of the larger story of Texas itself, a story shaped by land, cattle, transportation, immigration, business, and the extraordinary scale of the American frontier. What began with Richard King studying the difficult landscape of South Texas had grown into a ranch empire that survived wars, economic changes, and generations of leadership. Today, King Ranch remains a powerful symbol of Texas ranching and American expansion. But behind the enormous acreage and legendary reputation is a much more human story, one of ambition, risk, partnership, family, and persistence. Richard King did not simply build a ranch. He created a legacy that outlived him, and helped shape the identity of South Texas for generations to come.